On a freezing winter night at a Chicago hospital, a billionaire stood in despair as he watched his wife lie barely breathing in the emergency room. Even the top doctors were helpless, unable to find the cause, forced to watch her grow weaker by the hour. Just when all hope seemed lost, a black cleaning man stepped forward and pointed out a fatal gap in their diagnosis. What none of them knew was that this janitor had once been a brilliant doctor, and his words not only saved the billionaire's wife but set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Andrew Henderson's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood in the corner of Trauma Bay 3 at Chicago General Hospital, both hands wrapped tight around the mop handle, watching 12 medical staff swarm around the elderly woman convulsing on the gurney. His navy blue coveralls blended into the shadows. His name badge hung slightly crooked on his chest. To everyone in that room he was invisible, just the janitor who happened to be cleaning nearby when the emergency came in. But Andrew wasn't cleaning. He was watching. Really watching. And what he saw was going to force him to make a choice he'd sworn he'd never make again. The wind screamed outside, throwing snow against the windows with a fury that made the thick glass shudder. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered as the backup generators struggled. It was 2 in the morning on a December night, cold enough to freeze your breath in your lungs. Dr. Patricia Williams stood at the head of the gurney, her black hair escaping its tight bun, sweat beading on her forehead despite the winter cold seeping through the walls. She was the chief of emergency medicine, one of the best doctors in Chicago. She'd been on shift for 19 hours straight, and right now she looked terrified. "Give me 2 milligrams of lorazepam," she barked. A resident injected the medication. The woman's body kept jerking with violent spasms. The cardiac monitor shrieked. Blood pressures dropping, 80/40, oxygen saturation at 86. Andrew's eyes tracked every movement, every number, every symptom with an intensity that would have seemed strange if anyone had been paying attention. But no one was. They never did. For 8 years he'd been a ghost in these hallways, pushing his cleaning cart past the nurses' stations where he used to write orders, mopping floors in trauma bays where he used to save lives. 8 years of being invisible. 8 years of watching other doctors make decisions he would have made differently. 8 years of keeping his mouth shut because the last time he'd spoken up, they'd taken everything from him. Through the glass partition separating the trauma bay from the waiting area, Andrew could see a man standing rigid, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass. Richard Beaumont. Andrew recognized him from the society pages that sometimes got left in the break room. Late 50s, silver hair perfectly styled even at 2 in the morning, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Andrew made in 6 months. The man's face was stripped of its usual confidence, raw with terror. His lips were moving, saying something Andrew couldn't hear through the glass. 12 of you, the words finally broke through the chaos. Richard's voice cracked somewhere between rage and prayer. 12 of you, and none of you can save her. Nobody answered, they were too busy trying. Dr. Brown reached for another syringe. Start a dopamine drip, 5 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Andrew watched the nurse hang the bag. Watched the clear liquid begin its journey into veins that couldn't handle what they were giving her. His stomach dropped. They're treating it like a cardiac event. But it's not, he caught himself, jaw clenching tight. Not your business, not your patient, not your problem. But then he saw it. The slight bluish tint around her lips, barely visible under the harsh lights, the faint ammonia smell cutting through the sharp antiseptic of the ER, so subtle most people wouldn't notice it. The specific rhythm of her muscle spasms, not quite like typical seizures, something deeper, something systemic. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if she were standing beside him. Rose Johnson had raised him after his parents died, worked 3 jobs to put him through medical school, died the year before everything fell apart. God gave you a gift, Andrew. A gift for seeing what others can't. That's not something you keep to yourself, that's something you use. Heart rates climbing, 142, she's in VTAC. Dr. Brown's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. Prepare epinephrine, 1 milligram IV push. No 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 no. Andrew's fingers went white around the mop handle. The epinephrine would spike her already failing system. With liver enzymes that high, because that's what this was, he could see it now, clear as day. Hepatic encephalopathy in full crisis. The EPI could trigger cardiac arrest. They were about to make everything worse. The nurse drew up the epinephrine, clear liquid in a small syringe, danger in a dose. Andrew thought about the apartment he'd go back to after his shift. Thought about the ramen noodles waiting in his cabinet, the rent that was already 2 weeks late, the manager who'd promised eviction if he missed another payment. Thought about how hard he'd worked to become invisible, to survive in the spaces where nobody looked too closely. Thought about the last time he'd stepped out of the shadows. But then he looked at the woman on the gurney. Really looked at her. Under the harsh lights and surrounded by all that chaos, she reminded him of his grandmother. The same weathered hands that had probably spent a lifetime caring for others. The same dignity, even in crisis. He thought about Rose, dying alone in a county hospital because she'd given everything to him and left nothing for herself. He thought about the promise he'd made at her funeral, standing in the rain because he couldn't afford an umbrella, that he'd honor her sacrifice by using his gift, no matter the cost. The nurse stepped toward the gurney, syringe raised. Andrew set down his mop. The plastic handle clattered against the tile floor, the sound somehow cutting through all the chaos. For a split second, the room went quiet except for the monitors and the howling wind outside. "Stop," his voice came out steady, stronger than he'd heard it sound in 8 years. "Don't give her that." Every head in the room turned. 12 pairs of eyes, all staring at the janitor in the corner, who'd just told the chief of emergency medicine what to do. Dr. Brown's face went from pale to flushed. "Security, get this man out of here." But Andrew didn't move. He looked at the woman on the gurney, at her slightly yellow-tinged tongue visible when her jaw spasmed open, at the vertical ridges in her fingernails that everyone else had missed, at the titanic contractions in her hands that spoke of severe electrolyte imbalance. "If you give her that epinephrine," Andrew said quietly, "you could trigger cardiac arrest. You're treating a cardiac event, but this isn't cardiac. Look at her tongue, look at the ridges in her nails. Smell her breath, that's ammonia. Her liver's failing, this is hepatic encephalopathy." The room stayed frozen. Dr. Brown's hand was still raised, signaling for security, but her eyes had flickered to the patient, then back to Andrew. Something in his voice, the certainty, the clinical precision, made her hesitate. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. Andrew swallowed hard. "Someone who's seen this before." A young resident, Dr. Emma Foster, fresh out of her residency at Northwestern, suddenly lunged for the computer terminal. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the preliminary lab work that had just come through. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Ammonia level is 173. The number hung in the air like a grenade. Normal ammonia levels ran below 50. 173 meant the woman's liver had essentially stopped filtering toxins from her blood. Those toxins were flooding her brain, causing the seizures, the confusion, the crisis that everyone had mistaken for something else." Dr. Brown's face went white. The syringe in the nurse's hand seemed to pulse with deadly potential. "Put it down," Dr. Brown said quietly. The nurse set the epinephrine aside, like it was made of glass. The chief turned to Andrew, and something in her expression had shifted. Fear, yes, but also a desperate kind of hope. And maybe, beneath the exhaustion and the fear, a flicker of recognition, like she was seeing something she'd missed in her 19 hours of sleep deprivation. "What do we do?" Andrew took a step forward, then another. The circle of medical staff parted like water around him. After 8 years of being invisible, of being looked through and walked around, they suddenly saw him. He reached the gurney, looked down at the woman whose name he didn't know, whose life hung by a thread so thin it was barely visible. "Lactulose," he said. 50 milliliters now. Rifaximin, 550 milligrams. And stop every medication that's metabolized through the liver. Her system can't handle it." He paused, then added, "If you've got her on any benzodiazepines, stop those too, they're making it worse." Dr. Brown stared at him for 3 heartbeats. Andrew could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the risk of trusting a janitor against the risk of losing a patient she'd already misdiagnosed. The exhaustion that had clouded her judgment warring with the instinct that had made her a good doctor in the first place. "Do it," she ordered. The team moved with renewed purpose. A nurse ran for the lactulose. Another adjusted the IV lines. Dr. Foster began canceling medication orders on the computer. Andrew stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd done it. After 8 years of silence, he'd spoken. After 8 years of being invisible, he'd made himself seen, and now, there was no taking it back. The woman's convulsions began to slow. Not immediately, hepatic encephalopathy didn't reverse in seconds, but the violence of her seizures decreased. Her breathing steadied. The numbers on the monitors started climbing back toward safe ranges. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours, then her eyes fluttered open. Confused, frightened, but open. Alive. Richard Beaumont, still pressed against the glass partition, let out a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. His legs seemed to give out, and he slid down to sit on the floor, head in his hands. Dr. Brown turned to Andrew. Her face was unreadable, somewhere between gratitude and shell shock. "Who are you really?" Andrew met her eyes. "My name is Andrew Johnson. I was a doctor, 8 years ago." "What happened?" He thought about answering. Thought about explaining the whole ugly story. James Whitmore, the lawsuit, the medical board, the systematic destruction of everything he'd spent his life building. But his throat felt tight, and the words wouldn't come. Not yet. Not here. Instead he just said, "I made a choice. It cost me everything." He turned to leave. Made it 3 steps before Dr. Brown called out, "Wait." Andrew stopped, but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said quietly, and her voice cracked with emotion and exhaustion. "You saved her life, and you saved me from making a terrible mistake." Andrew nodded once, then continued toward the door. He needed to get out. Needed to leave before the adrenaline wore off and his hands started shaking again. Before the weight of what he'd just done crashed down on him. He'd made it to the hallway when Richard Beaumont caught up with him. "Please." The man's voice was rough with emotion. "Please, just wait a moment." Andrew stopped, turned. Up close, Richard looked older than his society page photos. Lines bracketed his mouth. His eyes were red-rimmed. He'd loosened his tie, and his perfect hair was disheveled. "That woman in there," Richard said. "That's Eleanor, my wife. We've been married 33 years, his voice cracked. "You saved her life." "The doctors would have figured it out," Andrew said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I just know." Richard cut him off. "They wouldn't have. I watched them. They were so sure it was her heart. Dr. Brown, she's brilliant, but she's been on shift since yesterday morning. She was too tired to see what was right in front of her. If you hadn't spoken up." He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Andrew didn't know what to say to that. So he just nodded. "Let me pay you," Richard said suddenly. "Whatever you need. Name the amount." Something cold settled in Andrew's stomach. "I don't want your money." "Then what can I do?" "There has to be something. I can't just—" Richard's voice broke. "She's everything to me, everything. And you saved her when you had every reason to stay silent." Andrew thought about his late rent, his empty refrigerator, the medical school loans that had followed him through bankruptcy like shadows. He thought about 8 years of scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans while watching other people do the work he'd trained his whole life to do. "There's nothing," he said. "I'm just glad she's okay." He turned to leave again. Made it 5 steps this time, before another voice stopped him. Andrew Johnson. He knew that voice. Cold. Professional. Utterly without mercy. Margaret Winters stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 security guards. The hospital's director of administration had iron gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and eyes like chips of glacial ice. She'd been the one to hire him as a janitor 8 years ago, after every other hospital in Chicago had turned him away. She'd known exactly who he was, what he'd lost, and she'd given him the only job available to a doctor without a license. Now she was going to take that away too. "Miss Winters," Andrew said carefully. "You just practiced medicine without a license," she said. "That's a felony in Illinois." The hallway seemed to tilt. Andrew heard Richard Beaumont start to protest behind him, but Margaret held up one hand, silencing him with the gesture. "Give me your hospital ID." Andrew's hands were steady as he unclipped the badge from his coveralls. He looked at it for a moment, the photo they'd taken 8 years ago on his first day as a janitor, when he'd still hoped that somehow, someday, he might find his way back to medicine. When he'd still believed in redemption. He handed it over. "You're terminated effective immediately." Margaret said, "You'll be escorted from the building." If you return to hospital property, you'll be arrested for trespassing. The hospital's legal team will be reviewing this incident and will be filing a report with the state attorney's office. But he saved her life. Richard's voice rose, angry now. You can't. Mr. Beaumont. Margaret's voice could have frozen the snow outside. I understand you're upset, but this man broke the law. We have protocols. We have systems. We cannot allow systems. Richard stepped between Margaret and Andrew. Your systems were killing my wife. This man saved her when your 12 exhausted staff members couldn't see past the obvious diagnosis. That's not the point. That's exactly the point. Margaret's face went stiff. Mr. Beaumont, I appreciate your generous donations to this hospital, but donations? Richard's laugh was bitter. I've given this hospital $14 million over the past decade, and tonight I watched your systems nearly murder the woman I love because no one would listen to the one person who actually knew what was wrong. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation, maybe, or fear. The kind of fear that came from realizing you'd made a mistake that might cost more than you could afford. Security, she said quietly. Escort Mr. Johnson from the building. The guards moved forward. Andrew didn't resist. He'd known this was coming from the moment he'd opened his mouth in that trauma bay. Some part of him had always known it would end like this. Richard tried to follow, still arguing, but Margaret blocked his path. Your wife needs you, Mr. Beaumont. I suggest you return to her. Andrew let the guards lead him away, down the familiar hallways where he'd spent 8 years invisible, past the nurses' stations where he'd emptied trash cans at 3 in the morning, through the service corridors where he'd eaten lunch alone, watching through windows as the doctors did rounds. They took him to the staff locker room to collect his things. It didn't take long. A spare uniform, a battered paperback, a photo of his grandmother in a cheap plastic frame. Everything that remained of Dr. Andrew Johnson fit in a box small enough to carry under one arm. The guards walked him to the service entrance. The storm had intensified, snow falling so thick it was almost impossible to see the parking lot beyond the overhang. The wind cut through his thin jacket like knives. Sorry, man, one of the guards said quietly. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes. For what it's worth, what you did in there was pretty incredible. Andrew just nodded. Didn't trust himself to speak. He stepped out into the storm. The bus didn't come for 45 minutes. Andrew stood at the bus shelter as snow settled on his shoulders, watching early traffic inch along ice-slicked streets. His feet went numb, then his fingers. The box under his arm felt heavier with every passing minute. He could have called a cab, but the cold felt necessary, something physical to match the hollow weight inside him. When the bus finally arrived, the sky was turning that dull gray Chicago called dawn. Andrew climbed aboard, dropped his last bills into the fare machine, and took a seat in the back. The bus was nearly empty, a few night shift workers, a homeless woman asleep across 2 seats, a fast food employee staring at his phone with exhausted eyes. Andrew closed his eyes and tried not to think. Not about Eleanor Beaumont convulsing on the gurney. Not about the ammonia smell he'd recognized instantly. Not about the way Dr. Brown had looked at him afterward, like she'd seen a ghost. Maybe he was one. Maybe he'd been dead for 8 years and just hadn't noticed. He got off 6 blocks from his apartment and walked through silent streets, lined with boarded storefronts. Inglewood didn't catch people on the way up, it caught them on the way down. It was where you landed when you ran out of options. His building was a tired 3-story walk-up, brick-stained by decades of neglect. He climbed the stairs and let himself into apartment 2C. Nothing had changed. 1 room, a kitchenette, a radiator clanking just enough to keep the pipes alive, a small window overlooking an alley where someone had spray-painted hope on a brick wall. Andrew set the box down and stood still, untethered. For 8 years he'd had a routine, now even that was gone. He looked out the window, listening to sirens and distant arguments. Thought about Eleanor Beaumont, about whether she'd remember, about whether it mattered. His phone buzzed, a Chicago number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail. but something, curiosity maybe, or just the need for human connection, made him pick up. "Hello? Andrew Johnson," a man's voice. Educated, urgent, familiar. "Who's asking?" "My name is Richard Beaumont, we met at the hospital. I need to see you." Andrew closed his eyes. Of course he should have expected this. "Mr. Beaumont, I appreciate what you tried to do back there, but please," the word came out raw, stripped of all the polish and confidence Andrew had seen at the hospital. "Just give me an hour. That's all I'm asking. 1 hour of your time, and I'll never bother you again if you don't want me to." Andrew should have said no. Should have hung up and blocked the number, and moved on with whatever remained of his life. He had nothing to offer this man, nothing to gain from this conversation, but something in Richard's voice stopped him. A desperation that felt familiar. The sound of a man who'd seen something that changed him and couldn't let it go. "How did you get my number?" "I have resources." A pause. "I also have questions. And I think you deserve to have someone listen to your story. Really listen." Andrew walked to the window, looked out at the gray morning, at the snow still falling. "There's a diner on 63rd called Maggie's. You know it. I'll find it." 1 hour, Andrew said. That's all I need." The line went dead. Andrew stood there for a long moment, phone still pressed to his ear, wondering what the hell he just agreed to. Then he set it down and went to shower. If he was going to meet Richard Beaumont, he wanted to be clean. The hot water ran out after 5 minutes, as it always did. Andrew stayed anyway, letting the cold shock him awake. He thought about the last 8 hours, about speaking up, about the look on Dr. Brown's face, about Eleanor Beaumont's breathing finally steadying, about Margaret Winters, the security guards, and the box of his belongings waiting on the counter. He'd done it again, chosen someone else over himself, paid the price. But standing there shivering under cold water, he realized he didn't regret it. Eleanor was alive. He'd honored the oath he'd taken, the promise he'd made to his grandmother. Staying silent would have cost him more than his job. It would have cost him his soul. Maggie's diner sat on a corner lot that had probably mattered once. Now it lived between a check-cashing place and a boarded storefront, its neon sign flickering in the gray morning. The coffee was hot, the food cheap, and Maggie, 70, gravel-voiced, endlessly kind, didn't ask questions. Andrew had been a regular for 8 years. He arrived early, ordered coffee and eggs he wasn't hungry for, and slid into his usual booth by the window. The morning crowd filtered in: construction workers, bus drivers, elderly regulars, who came at the same time every day. The diner smelled like bacon grease and coffee, and something comforting Andrew couldn't name. For the first time since leaving the hospital, he felt almost steady. Whatever came next, he would face it awake. Maggie herself brought his food. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she commanded the space like a general. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. "Long night, you get fired again." Andrew managed a weak smile. "How'd you know?" 25 years running this place, you learn to read people." She set the plate down in front of him. "What happened?" "I helped someone." Maggie snorted. "Of course you did. That's your problem, Andrew. You've got too much conscience for this world." She patted his shoulder. "Eat your eggs. Whatever it is, it'll look better with food in your stomach." She wasn't wrong. Andrew made himself eat, even though everything tasted like cardboard. He was halfway through when Richard Beaumont arrived. The man looked absurd walking into Maggie's $1,000 suit in a $20 diner, Italian leather shoes on linoleum floors that had seen better decades. Every head in the diner turned to watch him enter. But to Richard's credit, he didn't seem to notice or care. He scanned the room, found Andrew, and headed straight for the booth. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard said, sliding into the seat across from Andrew. Up close, in better light, he looked worse than he had at the hospital. His eyes were bloodshot. His hair, so perfectly styled before, was disheveled. He'd missed a button on his shirt. The man looked like he'd been through a war. "How's your wife?" Andrew asked. "Stable. They moved her to ICU, started her on the treatment you recommended. The neurologist came in around 5 this morning." Richard's voice caught. He said if they'd given her the epinephrine, her already compromised system could have gone into complete failure. "You were right. About all of it." Andrew just nodded. Didn't know what to say to that. Maggie came over, eyeing Richard with the kind of suspicion she reserved for anyone who looked like they might cause trouble or couldn't afford the bill. "Coffee, please," Richard said. "Black." She poured, gave Andrew a look that said everything okay, and moved on when he nodded. Richard wrapped both hands around the mug like he was trying to warm himself from the inside out. "I spent the last 6 hours learning about you, Dr. Johnson." Andrew's stomach clenched. "It's just Andrew now. I'm not a doctor. You were though. Graduated top of your class from Northwestern Medical School. Did your residency at Cook County. Published 4 papers before you were 30. By all accounts you were brilliant." Richard paused. "And then 8 years ago, James Whitmore destroyed you." The name landed like a punch. Andrew felt his jaw tighten, his hands curl into fists under the table. He forced himself to breathe. Forced himself to stay calm even as the old rage and humiliation rose up like bile in his throat. "You did your homework," he said quietly. "I did. I made some calls, talked to people who knew you back then. Found the court records and the medical board transcripts." Richard met his eyes. "And I want to hear it from you. What really happened?" Andrew looked out the window. Watched the morning traffic crawl past. Watched people hurrying through the cold to jobs and lives and purposes. Normal people doing normal things, their worlds intact, their identities secure. "Why does it matter?" "Because I owe you a debt I can never repay," Richard said. "And because what I've read doesn't make sense. The official story is that you violated hospital protocol, endangered a major donor, got sued, and lost your medical license for gross negligence. But everyone I've talked to, everyone who actually knew you back then, says that's not what happened at all." Andrew turned back to Richard. The man was leaning forward, intense, waiting. There was something in his expression that Andrew recognized. The look of someone who'd seen an injustice and couldn't let it stand. The look of someone who believed that truth mattered. It was a look Andrew hadn't seen in a long time. "You want the real story?" Andrew asked. "Yes." Andrew took a long drink of his coffee. It had gone lukewarm, but he didn't care. He was stalling, trying to decide if he really wanted to do this. If he wanted to excavate the worst moment of his life for a stranger in a diner. The wound had scabbed over in 8 years. Did he really want to rip it open again? But Richard had asked. And something about the way he'd asked, like Andrew's truth was worth hearing. Like what had happened to him actually mattered, made it impossible to refuse. "It was January 8th, Andrew began. 8 years ago, 2017. There was a blizzard, just like last night. The ER was slammed. We had a 60-car pileup on the Dan Ryan, 2 building fires, and about 100 people who'd slipped on ice and broken something. I'd been on shift for 18 hours straight." Richard listened without interrupting. "Around 11:30 at night, 2 patients came in at almost exactly the same time. James Whitmore, I'd never met him before but everyone knew who he was. Major hospital donor, real estate developer, connected to half the politicians in the city. He came in complaining of chest pain. Initial assessment showed it was probably anxiety or maybe acid reflux, but chest pain gets priority protocol, so we started the cardiac workup." Andrew paused, the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The fluorescent lights. The smell of antiseptic and fear. The weight of exhaustion making everything feel distant and unreal. The other patient was a woman named Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, homeless. She'd been beaten and robbed, left in an alley in 20-degree weather. She had internal bleeding. I could see it just looking at her. Her abdomen was distended. She was going into hypovolemic shock. She needed immediate surgery or she was going to die. But Whitmore came in first, Richard said quietly. "No, they arrived within minutes of each other. But the triage nurse, following standard protocol, put Whitmore ahead of Sarah because chest pain ranks higher on the priority scale than trauma without obvious life threat. Because his complaint sounded more serious on paper. Because," Andrew's voice went flat, "because that's how the system works. So you had to choose. I was the senior attending. It was my call." Andrew looked down at his hands. After 8 years he could still see the blood on them. Sarah's blood. The cardiac workup on Whitmore would take at least 20 to 30 minutes. EKG, troponin levels, chest x-ray, full protocol. Sarah didn't have 30 minutes. She had maybe 10. "So you chose her." "I chose her." Andrew's voice was barely above a whisper. I took her straight to surgery, stabilized her. She'd ruptured her spleen and had massive internal bleeding. Another 15 minutes and she would have died on the table. As it was, we nearly lost her twice during the procedure. He looked up at Richard, and by the time I got back to Whitmore, he'd been waiting an hour and 40 minutes. He was furious, threatened to sue the hospital, sue me personally, ruin my career. I told him I'd followed proper medical protocol. You treat the patient in the most immediate danger first. That's not just ethics, that's the law, standard of care. But he didn't care. He didn't care. Andrew agreed. He filed a lawsuit claiming I'd endangered his life through gross negligence and racial discrimination. Said I'd ignored his chest pain because Sarah was black and he was white, and I'd prioritized her for racist reasons. The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. It was complete bullshit. I'd treated the patient who was actively dying. But he had money and lawyers and connections, and I had, he gestured at himself. I had student loans and a public defender and the truth, which turned out not to be enough. Richard's face had gone hard. What did the hospital do? They threw me under the bus. The words came out cold. Whitmore threatened to pull all his donations, sue the hospital for millions, tank their reputation, so they settled with him. Part of the settlement was that I'd lose my medical license. They claimed I'd violated triage protocols, acted recklessly, endangered a patient's life. The medical board held a hearing. He stopped, couldn't finish. Even after 8 years, the memory of that hearing, the 7 board members looking at him with contempt and pity, the votes being counted, the gavel coming down on his career, made his chest tight. They took your license, Andrew nodded. Whitmore wanted more than that. He wanted me destroyed. Completely. He made sure I couldn't get another job in medicine, even as a consultant or researcher. Couldn't get malpractice insurance. Couldn't work as a physician's assistant or a nurse or anything else in healthcare. He used his connections to blacklist me from every hospital in the state. His voice cracked. He wanted to make sure I'd never forget what happens when someone like me crosses someone like him. So you became a janitor. I became whatever I could to survive. Andrew met Richard's eyes. For 8 years, I've mopped floors in the hospital where I used to save lives. I've watched other doctors make mistakes I could have prevented. I've seen patients die because no one asked the janitor what he thought. His voice was raw now, and I kept my mouth shut because I had no choice. Because speaking up had already cost me everything. Because I learned that the world doesn't reward courage, it punishes it. Until last night. Until last night, they sat in silence. Richard's coffee had gone cold, untouched. Outside, the snow had started falling again, softer now but steady, covering the city in white, making everything look clean and new and false. Sarah Mitchell, Richard said finally. The woman you saved, where is she now? Andrew shook his head. I don't know. The hospital discharged her after 3 days. I tried to follow up but she'd moved on. She was homeless, Richard. No permanent address, no phone number. She just disappeared into the city. For all I know she's dead now, or still on the streets, or, he couldn't finish. Richard pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. I'll find her. Why? Because she's part of this story. Because her life mattered enough for you to sacrifice your career. He looked up, and there was something fierce in his expression. And because I'm going to fix this, Andrew. I'm going to get your license back. Andrew laughed. It came out harsh, broken, nearly hysterical. You can't. It's been 8 years, the case is closed. Whitmore won. He always wins. Men like him always win. Whitmore won because he had money and power and you didn't. Richard leaned forward. Now you have me. I don't want your charity. This isn't charity, this is justice. Richard's voice was steel. You saved my wife's life last night. You threw away your safety and your job and probably your freedom to save a woman you'd never met. You did it because it was right. Because you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't. He paused. I'm a wealthy man, Andrew. I've spent my life making money, building things, accumulating power, and until last night, I thought that's what mattered. But watching Eleanor almost die, watching 12 medical professionals fail to do what you saw in seconds, it showed me something. What? That there are kinds of wealth that have nothing to do with money, and that the system is broken in ways I never bothered to notice because it wasn't breaking me. Richard's jaw set. So I'm going to use every dollar, every connection, every ounce of power I have to fix what was done to you. Not because I owe you, though I do, but because it's right. Because you deserve it, because the system that destroyed you needs to be challenged. Andrew wanted to believe him. Wanted it so badly it hurt. But he'd learned not to hope 8 years ago, when the medical board had voted unanimously to revoke his license and no one, not the hospital, not his colleagues, not the patients he'd saved, had stood up for him. Why? He asked quietly. Why do you care? You don't know me. We met 4 hours ago. Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. Eleanor and I met when we were 20. I was in law school at Northwestern. She was teaching 2nd grade at an inner-city school in Englewood. I came from money, old Chicago money, the kind with buildings named after my family. She came from nothing. Her father was a factory worker, her mother cleaned houses. My family didn't approve. They said she was beneath me, that I should marry someone from our social class, someone who understood our world. He smiled slightly, lost in memory. I married her anyway. Best decision I ever made. And for 33 years, she's been the only thing keeping me human. Every time I've gotten too obsessed with making money or building my empire, or caring about things that don't actually matter, she's reminded me what does. She volunteers at homeless shelters every week. She tutors kids who can't afford private teachers. She sees the people I used to walk right past without noticing. His eyes met Andrew's, and they were bright with unshed tears. Last night, I almost lost her, and the only reason I didn't, is because a man who had every reason to stay silent, chose to speak up, chose to risk everything to save a stranger. Richard's voice cracked. Eleanor would never forgive me if I didn't help you, and I'd never forgive myself, because you did what I've spent 33 years claiming to believe in, but never actually acting on. You put your principles ahead of your survival, and you paid for it. Andrew felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for 8 years, holding him together through the worst of it, keeping him functional but frozen. He felt it begin to thaw, and it hurt like blood rushing back into a limb that had gone numb. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, you can try. Andrew took a shaky breath. But I'm not making any promises. I've been down this road before, Richard. I've fought this fight. I've stood in front of that medical board and pleaded my case and watched them vote against me anyway. And I lost. Lost everything. You lost alone, Richard said. This time you won't be. Chapter 3. Building the case. It took Richard Beaumont 3 days to find Sarah Mitchell. She was living in Indianapolis, working at a homeless shelter called New Beginnings. She'd gotten clean 5 years ago, after nearly dying from an overdose in an alley not far from where she'd been beaten 8 years earlier. She had a small apartment, a steady job, a life she'd built from nothing. When Richard's private investigator showed up at the shelter, and explained why they needed to talk to her, Sarah had asked for a moment. She'd gone into the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes. Then she'd come out, wiped her eyes and said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Richard called Andrew with the news. "We found her. She's alive, Andrew, and she wants to help." Andrew sat on his bed. He'd been spending most of his time there, unable to muster the energy to do much else, and felt something break open inside him. "She's alive, alive and thriving," she said. Richard's voice caught. "She said she's spent 8 years wondering what happened to you, wondering if she could ever repay you for saving her life." "There's nothing to repay. That's not how she sees it. She'll testify, Andrew. Whatever we need, she'll do it." After Richard hung up, Andrew sat in the dim light of his apartment, and thought about Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old when he'd last seen her, covered in blood and bruises, dying on a gurney. 42 now, clean, working, living. He'd saved her life, and it had cost him everything. But she was alive. That had to mean something. It took Richard 3 more days to hire the lawyer. Thomas Sterling looked exactly like what he was, one of Chicago's most feared medical malpractice attorneys. 62 years old, steel gray hair, a face carved from granite, and eyes that could dissect a lie at 20 paces. He'd won $200 million in settlements over his 30-year career, and he'd never lost a medical licensing case. He met Andrew and Richard in his downtown office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, furniture that probably cost more than Andrew's annual salary, law books lining every wall. "I've reviewed your case," Thomas said without preamble. He sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "And I'll be honest with you, Dr. Johnson. This is going to be nearly impossible." Andrew's heart sank. "So you won't take it?" "I didn't say that." Thomas opened a file folder. "I said nearly impossible. There's a difference. Do you know how rare it is to get a medical license reinstated after 8 years? The board doesn't overturn its own decisions, unless there's new evidence of fraud, or serious procedural violations, and even then, the burden of proof is astronomical." "So what do we need?" Richard asked. "We need to prove the original hearing was fundamentally unjust. We need witnesses willing to testify against the hospital and Whitmore. We need documentation showing the board was influenced improperly. We need the medical board to admit they made a mistake, which they will fight tooth and nail to avoid, because it opens them up to liability." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "And even if we do all that, there's no guarantee we'd win." "So you're saying it's hopeless," Andrew said quietly. "I'm saying it's a long shot, the longest I've ever taken. But," Thomas pulled out another document, "I've done some preliminary investigation, and there are some things that don't add up about your original hearing." Andrew leaned forward. "Like what?" "Like the fact that multiple doctors who wanted to testify on your behalf were told by hospital administration that it would be career-limiting to do so. Like the fact that the medical board expedited your hearing. Normally these things take months, but yours was scheduled in 3 weeks. Like the fact that James Whitmore made a substantial donation to the Illinois Medical Association 2 weeks before your hearing." Thomas looked up. "None of this is proof of corruption. But it's enough to start pulling threads." Richard stood up. "Thomas, you've been my attorney for 15 years. You've handled every major legal issue for my company. I've paid you, by my estimation, somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million in fees. Your point." "My point is that I'm calling in every favor, every debt, every ounce of goodwill I've built with you." Richard's voice was steel. "I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, to take this case, pro bono if necessary, because it's right, and because if there's anyone who can pull off the impossible, it's you." Thomas looked between Richard and Andrew for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Pro bono," he said finally. "That's a first for me. Is that a yes?" "That's a let me dig deeper and see if there's anything we can use." Thomas turned to Andrew. "But I'm not making any promises. If I take this on, you need to understand, we're going into battle against a system that doesn't want to admit fault. James Whitmore is still one of the most powerful men in Chicago. The hospital that threw you out is still operating under the same administration. The medical board members who voted against you still sit on that board. They will fight this with everything they have." "I understand," Andrew said. "Do you? Because if we do this and we lose, it won't just confirm the original decision, it'll cement it. You'll never practice medicine again. There will be no appeals, no second chances. This is it. Is that a risk you're willing to take?" Andrew thought about the last 8 years. Thought about mopping floors and keeping his mouth shut, and watching people suffer while he stood by helpless. Thought about Eleanor Beaumont convulsing on that gurney, about the ammonia smell and the blue tint around her lips, and the moment he'd decided that survival wasn't worth the cost of silence. "Yes," he said. "That's a risk I'm willing to take." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we have a lot of work to do." The next 4 months were a blur. Thomas's firm launched a full investigation into the original case. They subpoenaed hospital records, deposed hospital staff, interviewed doctors who'd worked with Andrew 8 years ago. They combed through every document, every email, every piece of paper trail they could find. Richard hired a team of private investigators to dig into Whitmore's dealings, to document his pattern of using wealth and influence to punish anyone who crossed him. And they started finding things. Small things at first. Irregularities in the medical board hearing procedure. emails between hospital administration about managing the Whitmore situation, financial records showing unusual donations from Whitmore to various medical organizations in the weeks leading up to Andrew's hearing. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Brown showed up at Richard's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Richard's assistant tried to turn her away. He was in a meeting with Thomas, but Dr. Brown pushed past her and walked straight into the conference room. "I need to talk to you," she said, "about Andrew Johnson." Richard exchanged a glance with Thomas. "Dr. Brown, this isn't a good time." "I know what happened 8 years ago," she interrupted. "I know what the hospital did, and I have proof." The room went very quiet. "What kind of proof?" Thomas asked carefully, his lawyer instincts immediately engaged. Dr. Brown sat down without being invited. She pulled a USB drive from her purse and set it on the table. Her hands were shaking slightly. 8 years ago, I was a resident. I wasn't involved in Andrew's case directly, but I heard about it. Everyone heard about it. The hospital administration made it very clear, Whitmore was untouchable. If anyone testified in Andrew's favor at the medical board hearing, they'd be fired. Not maybe, definitely. "Can you prove that?" Thomas asked. "I have emails. My attending at the time, Dr. Robert Chen, he's retired now, forwarded them to me by mistake. He was on a hospital-wide distribution list, and he accidentally CC'd me on several messages from administration to the department heads. Messages laying out exactly what they expected. No one was to defend Andrew Johnson. No one was to question the settlement. No one was to suggest that the hospital had any culpability in the decision. It was a coordinated effort to sacrifice Andrew to protect Whitmore's donations." Thomas took the USB drive and plugged it into his laptop. His eyes scanned the screen, and with each email he read, his expression grew darker. Richard watched over his shoulder, his face going from curious to shocked to furious. "This is conspiracy to obstruct justice," Thomas said quietly after several minutes. The hospital administration actively prevented witnesses from testifying at a medical board hearing. They coordinated with Whitmore's attorneys to ensure Andrew would lose his license. They threatened their own staff to maintain silence, and they documented it. They actually wrote it down and sent it through official channels. "Will it be enough?" Richard asked. Thomas looked up, and for the first time since they'd met, he was smiling. "It's more than enough. This is the smoking gun we needed." He turned to Dr. Brown. "You understand that if you testify, the hospital will come after you. They'll try to discredit you, maybe even threaten your license. Your career could be in jeopardy." Dr. Brown met his eyes steadily. "I know. I've been thinking about this for 8 years, about what I should have done, what I could have said. 2 months ago, Andrew saved a patient's life right in front of me. A patient I'd misdiagnosed because I was too exhausted and too arrogant to see what was right in front of me. He risked everything to do the right thing." Again, her voice cracked. "I can't stay silent anymore. I won't." "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Thomas asked. "Because I was afraid, because I had student loans and a career to protect, and I told myself it wasn't my fight." She wiped her eyes. "But I was wrong. It was my fight. It's all of our fight. Because if we don't stand up for doctors like Andrew, doctors who actually put patients first, then what's the point of any of this?" Thomas copied the files from the USB drive. "These emails mention other staff members who were threatened. Can you help us identify them? I can give you names. Whether they'll talk is another question." "We'll ask," Richard said. "If they say no, we respect that. But we have to try." Over the next weeks, they tracked down everyone mentioned in the emails. Some refused to talk. They were still employed at Chicago General, still afraid of retribution. But others, especially those who'd left the hospital or retired, were willing to testify. One by one, they built a case that showed a systematic effort to deny Andrew a fair hearing. They found Dr. Robert Chen in Arizona, enjoying his retirement. He agreed to testify, and provided additional emails showing how the hospital had promised Whitmore they'd handle the situation in exchange for maintaining his donations.
They found the triage nurse who'd been on duty the night of Sarah Mitchell and James Whitmore. She'd left nursing entirely, burned out and disillusioned. She testified that she'd been ordered by administration to change her written notes about that night, to make it appear that Andrew had acted more recklessly than he had. They found 11 other former patients of Andrew's, people he'd diagnosed correctly when others had missed it, people he'd treated with compassion when others had dismissed them, people whose lives he'd saved or improved through careful attention and genuine care. All of them agreed to testify about the doctor who'd seen them as human beings, who'd fought for them when no one else would. And they kept investigating James Whitmore. The private investigators dug into his business dealings, his political donations, his pattern of using lawsuits and financial pressure to silence critics. They found 3 other cases where Whitmore had threatened doctors or hospitals who displeased him. They found evidence of intimidation, of using wealth as a weapon, of a man who believed his money made him untouchable. By the time they were ready to file the petition with the medical board, they had a case that was no longer about one doctor's bad luck. It was about systematic corruption, about a healthcare system that prioritized donors over patients, about power being used to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. Thomas filed the petition on a Monday morning in early May, the petition for reinstatement of medical license, citing new evidence, procedural violations, and improper influence on the original hearing. The medical board had 30 days to respond. Andrew spent those 30 days in a state of suspended animation. He couldn't work, he had no job. He couldn't plan for the future. He didn't know if he'd have one. He just waited, watching the days tick by, trying not to hope too much, and failing completely. Richard called him daily with updates. The medical board had agreed to hold a hearing. They'd set it for early June. The Chicago Tribune had picked up the story. Doctor fights to reclaim license 8 years after controversial revocation. The coverage was mostly sympathetic, but there were plenty of voices defending the original decision, arguing that protocols existed for a reason, that Andrew had been rightly punished for his arrogance. Sarah Mitchell flew in from Indianapolis a week before the hearing. Andrew met her at a coffee shop near her hotel. He almost didn't recognize her. The broken, bleeding woman from 8 years ago had been transformed into someone healthy and whole. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes clear and bright.
"Dr. Johnson," she said, and then she was hugging him, crying into his shoulder. Thank you for saving my life. I'm just glad you're okay," Andrew managed to say. They sat and talked for 2 hours. Sarah told him about getting clean, about the long road back from addiction and homelessness, about the shelter where she now worked helping other people find their way out of the darkness. "I think about that night all the time," she said. "I was so sure I was going to die, and then you were there, and you looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth saving." She wiped her eyes. "I heard later what happened to you because of it. I'm so sorry, don't be. I'd make the same choice again. I know that's what makes you special." She took his hand. "And that's why I'm going to tell them the truth at that hearing, about what you did for me, about what it cost you, about why the system is broken when it punishes doctors like you." The night before the hearing, Andrew couldn't sleep. He lay in his small apartment staring at the ceiling, thinking about the past 8 years, thinking about all the ways his life could have gone differently if he'd made different choices. If he'd treated Whitmore first, if he'd stayed silent in the trauma bay, if he'd accepted his punishment and moved on. But he hadn't. He'd chosen conscience over comfort again and again, and tomorrow he'd find out if that had been wisdom or foolishness. His phone buzzed at 2 in the morning. A text from Richard: "Eleanor and I will be there tomorrow. Front row. You're not alone in this." Andrew read the message 3 times. He thought about Richard and Eleanor, about Dr. Brown and Sarah Mitchell, about Thomas Sterling working pro bono and all the people who'd agreed to testify. He thought about his grandmother Rose, about the promise he'd made at her funeral. He wasn't alone. He'd never been alone, not really. The system had tried to isolate him, to make him believe that his truth didn't matter. But all these people he'd saved, people he'd helped, people who'd witnessed what had been done to him, they were standing with him. Tomorrow they'd face the medical board together. And whatever happened, Andrew knew he'd spoken his truth. He'd honored his oath. He'd been the doctor his grandmother had raised him to be. That would have to be enough. Chapter 4. The hearing. The Illinois Medical Board hearing room looked exactly like Andrew remembered it from 8 years ago. Same wood-paneled walls, same fluorescent lights, same long table where the 7 board members sat. But this time, Andrew wasn't alone. Thomas Sterling sat to his right, a mountain of legal documents stacked in front of him. Richard and Eleanor Beaumont sat in the first row. Sarah Mitchell was there too, and in the back rows 14 of his former colleagues from Chicago General Hospital, including Dr. Williams and Dr. Foster. They'd all taken personal days to be there. Andrew felt tears prick his eyes when he'd walked in and seen them. The board chair, Dr. Helen Morrison, called the hearing to order at precisely 9 o'clock. She was in her mid-70s, stern-faced with iron-gray hair and reading glasses. She'd been on the board when they'd revoked Andrew's license 8 years ago, had voted against him. Andrew wondered if she'd thought about it since, if she'd lain awake any nights questioning that decision. "This is a petition for reinstatement of medical license," Dr. Morrison began. "Filed by Dr. Andrew Henderson, represented by attorney Thomas Sterling. The petition claims that the original license revocation was based on incomplete evidence and improper influence from external parties. Is that correct, Mr. Sterling?" Thomas stood. "It is, Dr. Morrison. And we have substantial new evidence that we believe will demonstrate that Dr. Henderson was not only wrongly accused but was the victim of a coordinated effort by Chicago General Hospital administration and Mr. James Whitmore to protect financial interests at the expense of justice." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Dr. Morrison banged her gavel. "We'll hear your evidence, Mr. Sterling. But I want to remind you that this board does not take kindly to accusations of impropriety." "I'm not claiming anything about the board's intentions," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "I'm presenting evidence about what the board was not told 8 years ago." Dr. Morrison's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Proceed." Thomas spent the next 90 minutes laying out the case methodically. He presented the emails Dr. Williams had provided, showing the hospital administration's coordinated effort to prevent anyone from testifying in Andrew's favor. He brought in hospital staff who admitted they'd been threatened with termination if they spoke up. He showed financial records proving that James Whitmore had made substantial donations to organizations connected to the medical board in the months leading up to Andrew's hearing. When Thomas finished, the hearing room was dead silent. Dr. Morrison cleared her throat. Her face had gone pale. "Mr. Sterling, what you're describing amounts to a conspiracy to obstruct a medical board hearing. I'm aware, and I have extremely serious evidence." Thomas's voice was quiet but carried weight. "I'm not asking this board to take responsibility for something you didn't know, but I am asking you to acknowledge that you were not given complete information 8 years ago." Dr. Morrison looked at the other board members. They conferred in whispers. Finally she turned back. "We'll hear testimony, starting with the petitioner. Dr. Henderson, please take the stand." Andrew stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness chair. Thomas started with easy questions. Name, age, education. Building Andrew's credentials brick by brick. Then they got to the night that changed everything. "Dr. Henderson," Thomas said, "please describe for the board what happened on the night of January 8, 2017. Andrew took a breath. 2 patients came into the ER within minutes of each other. James Whitmore and Sarah Mitchell. The triage nurse followed standard protocol and classified Mr. Whitmore as priority based on his complaint of chest pain. But when I assessed both patients myself, I determined that Miss Mitchell's condition was immediately life-threatening. She had obvious signs of internal bleeding and was going into hypovolemic shock. And Mr. Whitmore's condition, his vital signs were stable. His EKG showed no acute changes consistent with myocardial infarction. His symptoms were more consistent with a panic attack or acid reflux." Andrew looked directly at Dr. Morrison. "I made a clinical judgment based on medical necessity. You assess the available information and you act to save the patient in most immediate danger." "Why?" Andrew felt 8 years of frustration and grief and rage rise up. He swallowed it down, kept his voice level. "Because she was dying. Because the Hippocratic oath I took says first, do no harm. Because treating a potentially dying patient before completing a full cardiac workup on someone whose symptoms appeared stable isn't just ethical, it's required by medical protocol." But the hospital disagreed. The hospital was more concerned with protecting their relationship with a major donor than with acknowledging that I'd followed proper medical procedure. More murmurs from the gallery. One of the board members, Dr. Peter Walsh, leaned forward. "Dr. Henderson, how could you be certain you weren't missing a heart attack?" "I couldn't be absolutely certain," he admitted. "Medicine isn't about certainty, it's about probability and risk assessment." Mr. Whitmore's probability of having an acute MI based on his presentation was low. His risk if I delayed his workup by 30 minutes was minimal. Meanwhile, Miss Mitchell's probability of dying without immediate intervention was nearly 100%. He leaned forward. "I was making the call that any ethical emergency physician would make. You treat the one who's dying first. Always. That's not negligence. That's basic triage." Dr. Walsh sat back, his expression thoughtful. Thomas called Sarah Mitchell next. She walked to the stand steadily, though Andrew could see her hands shaking slightly. "They said I'd lost almost half my blood volume," Sarah said quietly. "They said if I'd waited another 15 or 20 minutes I probably would have died on the operating table. Dr. Henderson saved my life. And then he lost everything because of it." Thomas asked, "So from your perspective what happened that night?" Sarah looked directly at the board members. "A doctor saw a dying woman and decided her life was worth saving. Even though she was nobody, even though she was homeless and addicted, even though saving her meant making a powerful man wait." Her voice cracked. "Dr. Henderson chose to see me as human, and he paid for that choice for 8 years. She took a shaky breath. "I've been clean for 5 years now. I work at a homeless shelter in Indianapolis. I have an apartment. I have a life. I have a future. Because Dr. Henderson decided that I deserved one." There wasn't a dry eye in the gallery. Thomas called witness after witness, former patients, colleagues, Dr. Sullivan, who laid out the hospital's coordinated effort to silence anyone who might defend Andrew. And then Dr. Patricia Williams took the stand. She described the emails, the threats, the systematic way the hospital had sacrificed Andrew to protect Whitmore's donations. She admitted her own cowardice 8 years ago. "I should have testified at the original hearing," she said, her voice raw with regret. "I knew Andrew had made the right call, but I was afraid for my career, and I stayed silent. I've regretted that silence every single day." "What changed?" Thomas asked gently. 2 months ago, Andrew saved a patient's life right in front of me. A patient I'd misdiagnosed because I was exhausted. And then Andrew, working as a janitor, spoke up. He risked everything to do the right thing. Again, she wiped her eyes. He did it again. He chose conscience over survival. And watching him do that, I couldn't stay silent anymore. By the time the testimony was finished, it was late afternoon. But they weren't done yet. James Whitmore walked into the hearing room at 4:15. Andrew hadn't seen him in 8 years. The man looked older, he'd be in his mid-70s now, but still carried himself with arrogance. His suit probably cost more than Andrew had earned in a year as a janitor. Thomas stood immediately. "Dr. Morrison, Mr. Whitmore was not on our witness list." "He's on mine," said Whitmore's lawyer, Gregory Aldrich. "My client has a right to defend his reputation." Dr. Morrison considered. "We'll allow it. Mr. Whitmore, please take the stand." Whitmore settled into the witness chair like he owned it. Aldrich lobbed him softball questions. Whitmore painted himself as a victim, a man experiencing chest pain who'd been ignored for nearly 2 hours while the doctor treated someone else. "I believe Dr. Henderson made a snap judgment based on the patient's respective backgrounds," Whitmore said. "I was wealthy and white. The other patient was poor and black. He chose to prioritize her for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine." The accusation hung in the air. Andrew felt something dark and hot surge through his chest, not just anger but rage. 8 years of it, compressed and burning. This man had destroyed his life, had used his wealth as a weapon, had twisted a life-saving decision into something ugly. And here he sat, still lying, still wielding power like it was his birthright. Thomas stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Whitmore, you've testified that you believed you were having a heart attack that night. Were you?" Whitmore hesitated. "My doctor said I was at risk. That's not what I asked." "Did you in fact have a heart attack that night?" "No, but I could have, but you didn't." Thomas pulled out a document. "Your discharge summary shows completely normal cardiac workup. You were diagnosed with anxiety and acid reflux. Is that correct?"
The point, Mr. Whitmore, is that Dr. Henderson's clinical judgment was correct. Your symptoms were not cardiac, Miss. Mitchell's injuries were life-threatening. He made the right medical decision. Thomas's voice went cold. But you couldn't accept that, could you? That's not true, isn't it? Thomas pulled out another document. This is an email from you to the CEO of Chicago General Hospital, dated 3 days after the incident. In it you threaten to withdraw all future donations and file a lawsuit unless, quote, the doctor responsible is permanently removed from practice. Your words, Mr. Whitmore. The hearing room erupted. Whitmore's face went red. Dr. Morrison banged her gavel repeatedly. When the room quieted, Thomas continued, Mr. Whitmore, how much money have you donated to Chicago General Hospital over the years? I don't see how that's relevant. $14 million, Thomas said flatly. And in the year following Dr. Henderson's license revocation, you donated an additional $3 million. I support institutions I believe in. You bought a verdict, Thomas said. You used your wealth to ensure that a doctor who bruised your ego would never practice medicine again. Whitmore stood up, furious. I did nothing wrong. He endangered my life. He saved a life. Andrew hadn't meant to speak. The words erupted from him, propelled by 8 years of injustice. He was standing though he didn't remember rising. Sarah Mitchell was dying. You were having a panic attack. I made the call any ethical doctor would make. His voice shook with fury. And you couldn't handle the idea that someone else's life might matter as much as yours. That a homeless black woman might deserve medical care as much as a rich white man. The room went silent. I lost everything. My career, my license, my identity. I spent 8 years mopping floors in the hospital where I used to save lives because you decided that your wealth and your ego meant more than my oath to heal, more than my training, more than Sarah Mitchell's life. Andrew's voice cracked. You took everything from me. And for what? Because I made you wait. Because I had the audacity to treat someone else as if they mattered. He turned to face the board members directly. His hands were shaking but his voice was steady now. I don't know if you're going to give me my license back. Maybe you won't. Maybe some things are broken too badly to fix. But I want you to know. He paused. I want you to know that I'd do it again. Every single time. If I had to make that choice tonight, I'd make the same one. Because that's what the oath means. First, do no harm. Not first protect the wealthy. Not first cover your ass. First, do no harm. Always. He sat down. The silence stretched out. Dr. Morrison looked shaken. The other board members were pale. Finally she spoke. This board will recess to consider the evidence. We'll reconvene in 2 hours with our decision. They filed out. The gallery erupted. Richard and Eleanor came to Andrew. Eleanor hugged him tight. Whatever happens, she whispered, you told the truth. Andrew walked outside into the late afternoon sun. It was early June, warm. He stood on the steps and tried to breathe. Thomas found him there. That was quite a speech. I probably blew it, Andrew said. Maybe, or maybe you finally told your truth in a way they couldn't ignore. They stood in silence. Richard joined them, then Eleanor, then Sarah, then Dr. Williams. They formed a circle on the steps, all of them waiting together. 2 hours felt like 2 centuries. When the clerk finally said the board was ready, Andrew's legs nearly gave out. They filed back into the hearing room. The board members took their places. Dr. Morrison looked exhausted. She cleared her throat. This board has carefully reviewed all evidence presented today. We have also reviewed the original case file from 8 years ago, and we have found substantial discrepancies between what was presented to us then and what actually occurred. Andrew's heart started to pound. The evidence demonstrates that the original hearing was compromised by improper influence from hospital administration and external pressure from Mr. Whitmore. Key witnesses were prevented from testifying through threats and intimidation. Exculpatory evidence was withheld. She paused, looking directly at Andrew. Dr. Henderson, we owe you an apology. 8 years ago this board made a decision based on incomplete information. We believed we were upholding medical standards. In fact, we were complicit in an injustice. We allowed external pressure to influence our judgment, and you paid the price. Andrew couldn't breathe. After hearing today's testimony, after reviewing your record and after considering the extraordinary circumstances, she looked at each board member in turn. They nodded, one by one. This board votes 6-1 to immediately reinstate the medical license of Dr. Andrew Henderson. The hearing room exploded. Andrew sat frozen, unable to process what he just heard. 6-1. Reinstated, immediately. We find that your actions 8 years ago were not only ethical but exemplary. Dr. Morrison continued. You made the correct medical decision under extraordinary pressure, and you paid an unconscionable price. We hope that this reinstatement, while long overdue, begins to address that injustice. She stood. The other board members stood with her, and then one by one they bowed their heads to him. Andrew felt tears streaming down his face. Richard helped him stand. The gallery was on its feet, applauding, crying, cheering. Dr. Morrison banged her gavel one last time. Dr. Henderson, this board also wishes to issue a formal written apology. We failed you 8 years ago. We cannot give you back the years you lost, but we can acknowledge our error publicly and unequivocally. Andrew finally found his voice. Thank you, he managed to say. Thank you, Doctor. Morrison smiled. Go practice medicine, Dr. Henderson. Welcome back. Andrew Henderson stood outside Chicago General Hospital 3 weeks later, staring at the entrance. Now he wore pressed slacks, a button-down shirt and a white coat. Dr. Andrew Henderson, Maryland. Ready? Richard asked beside him. Ready? Andrew said. And this time he meant it. Dr. Williams was waiting by the elevator bay. She smiled. Welcome back. Thank you for everything. His first patient was a 7-year-old girl named Maya Sullivan. She'd been brought in 3 days ago with fever and rash. The resident had diagnosed strep throat and sent them home with antibiotics. But Maya had come back. The fever hadn't broken. Andrew reviewed the chart. Something nagged at him. Fever for 5 days, rash, red eyes, cracked lips. He examined Maya carefully. Bilateral conjunctivitis, cracked lips, diffuse rash, enlarged lymph nodes, red swollen palms and feet, Kawasaki disease. Has she had any pain in her joints? Andrew asked Carmen Sullivan, the exhausted mother. Her knees, Carmen said. Andrew felt his stomach drop. Joint pain meant they were in the window where cardiac complications could develop. He called Dr. Foster. I know you diagnosed strep and the rapid test was positive, but I'm worried we might be dealing with Kawasaki disease. Dr. Foster frowned. That's pretty rare. Maya has all 5 major diagnostic criteria, plus the joint pain suggests cardiac complications could be developing. Dr. Foster bit her lip. What do you want to do? Admit her, start IVIG and aspirin therapy, get a cardiology consult and an echocardiogram. Okay, doctor, Foster said. I'll put in the orders. 2 hours later the echocardiogram showed early inflammatory changes in Maya's coronary arteries. Kawasaki disease in the acute phase. If they'd sent her home she might have developed aneurysms. Dr. Foster found Andrew in the break room. You were right. You would have caught it if she'd come back again. Maybe, but you saw it today, on your first shift back. She studied him. Can I ask you something? Sure. What was it like, being here as a janitor, seeing mistakes you could have prevented? Andrew was quiet, painful, frustrating. Sometimes I'd see something and I'd have to just walk away, pretend I hadn't seen it. But you didn't walk away last time. No, I couldn't. Andrew looked at his hands. I'd spent 8 years convincing myself that silence was survival. But standing there watching Eleanor convulse, knowing what was wrong, I couldn't live with myself if I'd stayed quiet. I'm glad you're back. You remind us why we do this. By the time his shift ended at midnight, Andrew had diagnosed 4 potentially fatal conditions that might have been missed. Word was spreading through the ER. As he rode the bus home his phone rang. Richard, how was your first day? Exhausting. Good. Andrew smiled. I caught a case of Kawasaki disease. Of course you did. Richard paused. Listen, Eleanor and I want to take you to dinner this weekend, to celebrate. You don't have to. We want to. Please. Andrew thought about refusing, but he was tired of refusing kindness. Okay, dinner sounds good. His phone buzzed. A text. Dr. Henderson, this is Carmen Sullivan, Maya's mom. Thank you for saving my daughter's life. You're a miracle. Andrew read it 3 times. He wasn't a miracle. He was just a doctor doing his job. But to Carmen and Maya he supposed it might feel like a miracle. He texted back, "Just doing my job, wishing Maya a speedy recovery." For the first time in 8 years, Andrew Henderson fell asleep without the weight of regret crushing his chest. The restaurant Richard chose was elegant, the kind of place where menus didn't have prices. Eleanor looked healthy and vibrant. They ordered food Andrew couldn't pronounce, and wine that probably cost more than his weekly groceries. Over dessert, Richard leaned forward with intensity. "I have a proposition for you," Richard said. Andrew set down his fork. "What kind of proposition?" "You're working at Chicago General, which is great, but there's a need in this city that no one's addressing. The people in neighborhoods like Englewood, they don't have access to quality health care. The clinics are overcrowded, understaffed, operating on shoestring budgets." "I know," Andrew said. "I lived it." "What if we changed that?" Richard's eyes were bright. "What if we opened a community health center? Free care for anyone who needs it, funded by my foundation. Top quality doctors and equipment. Preventive medicine, chronic disease management, mental health services." Andrew stared at him. "That would cost millions." "I have millions." Richard reached across the table. "I want to use them for something that matters." "But why me?" "Because you understand," Richard said. "You've lived in those communities, you see patients as people, not cases. You have the courage to challenge systems that don't work." He paused. "I can provide the money and infrastructure, but I need you to lead it." Eleanor took Andrew's hand. "You saved my life. Let us help you save others." Andrew felt overwhelmed. "I need time to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Richard said. "But Andrew, this is your chance to change the system that broke you." That night, Andrew lay awake thinking. He thought about his grandmother Rose, who'd worked herself to death, about Sarah Mitchell who'd gotten a second chance, about Maya Sullivan, and all the patients who'd slipped through the cracks. He thought about Englewood, about the grandmother with uncontrolled diabetes, the kid with asthma who kept missing school, the working parents who delayed care.
Andrew had lived among them, had understood their struggles in a way most doctors never would. He picked up his phone and texted Richard, "Yes, let's do it." The response came immediately, "We start tomorrow." Finding the right location took 3 weeks. Then Richard's team found the old grocery store on 63rd and Halstead. It had been empty for 7 years. Windows broken, walls covered in graffiti. The neighbors called it the dead zone. Andrew stood in the middle of what used to be the produce section, looking up at water-stained ceiling tiles. "You're sure about this location?" he asked Richard. Richard nodded. "Within a mile radius we have high rates of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, asthma. The nearest primary care clinic is 3 miles away with a 3-month wait. 3 emergency rooms are constantly overwhelmed because people have nowhere else to go." He showed Andrew his tablet. "This is where the need is greatest. This is also where the money is the least," Andrew pointed out. "I know, that's why we're funding it through my foundation." Richard set down the tablet. "This isn't about profit, this is about care." Andrew walked through the space. He could see it taking shape: exam rooms, a waiting area with comfortable furniture and toys, a pharmacy dispensing medications at cost, space for health education classes, a place where people could come without being made to feel like they didn't belong. "What do you want to call it?" Richard asked. Andrew thought about his grandmother, sitting with him at the kitchen table after working a double shift, her hands swollen from being on her feet all day. She'd worked 3 jobs to put him through medical school, worked herself to death, heart failure at 62, probably preventable with regular health care. "The Rose Henderson Community Health Center," Andrew said. "After my grandmother." Richard smiled. "Perfect." The renovation took 4 months. But the real work was building trust with the community. Andrew started attending community meetings in Englewood. He listened to residents talk about their experiences with healthcare, the long waits, the condescending doctors, the insurance nightmares. At one meeting a woman stood up to challenge him. Her name was Dorothy Washington, 64 years old, diabetic, raising 3 grandchildren. "Why should we trust you?" she asked. Her voice was tired, skeptical. "Every few years someone promises to fix things. Then they leave and nothing changes." Andrew could have given her a polished answer, but something in Dorothy's expression made him tell the truth. "I lived here for 8 years, Andrew said. 2 blocks from where that clinic will be. I know what it's like to choose between medical care and rent. I know what it's like to be invisible. But you're not here anymore, Dorothy pointed out. You got your license back. You're right, I don't live here anymore, and I can't pretend I fully understand everything. Andrew took a breath. But I can promise you this, we're not going anywhere. This clinic is for this community. We'll listen to what you need, and if we're not meeting your needs, tell us. We'll change. Dorothy studied him for a long moment. We'll see, she said finally. Actions matter more than words. I agree completely. After the meeting, an older man approached Andrew. He was thin-weathered. I'm James Robinson. I've lived in this neighborhood 63 years, seen a lot of promises come and go. I'm sure you have. But I like what you said about listening. James paused. You really lived here? I did. Apartment 2C on 65th. I know that building. The elevator doesn't work. Still doesn't. I walk those stairs every day. James smiled slightly. Then maybe you do understand. He extended his hand. I'll give you a chance. Andrew shook his hand. I'll do my best not to make you regret it. Hiring staff was crucial. Andrew hired Dr. Yolanda Price as medical director. She'd grown up in Englewood, done her training at Northwestern, and spent 12 years running a federally qualified health center before it lost funding. This'll fail without community buy-in, she told Andrew bluntly on her first day. They stood in the half-finished clinic, surrounded by paint cans and drywall dust. If people don't trust us, they won't come. How do we build that trust? We show up. We listen, and we treat every single person who walks through that door like they matter. She fixed him with a hard stare. Can you do that? Yes. Even on the bad days. Even when some patient is yelling at you because the system has failed them so many times. Andrew thought about 8 years of being invisible. Yes, I can do that, because I've been on the other side of it. Dr. Price nodded slowly. That's why Richard chose you to run this place. They hired 4 nurses from the neighborhood. 3 medical assistants, a pharmacist named James Parker, a social worker named Lisa Martinez, a receptionist named Angela Miller who knew everyone. Dr. Williams agreed to volunteer 1 day a week. 2 other doctors from Chicago General joined part-time. Specialists agreed to see patients for free or reduced fees. 3 weeks before opening, they held a community open house. Over 200 people showed up. They toured the clinic, asking questions, examining exam rooms, checking out the pharmacy. Many were skeptical. Several asked, "What's the catch?" "Nothing's really free, no catch," Andrew told them repeatedly. "We'll ask about insurance, but if you don't have it or can't afford your copay, we'll still see you. That's the whole point." An elderly woman named Ruth asked, "Why would you do this?" "I get to be the kind of doctor I always wanted to be," Andrew said honestly. "I get to practice medicine focusing on patients, not profit, on healing, not billing codes." He paused. "I've spent 8 years watching a broken system fail people. This is my chance to build something better." Ruth studied him, then nodded. "We'll see, but it sounds good." After everyone left, Andrew and Dr. Price stood in the empty waiting room. "What do the comment cards say?" Andrew asked. Dr. Price had been reading through them. Mixture of hope and skepticism. "A lot of people asking if we're really going to be here long term." She looked up. One card just says, "Please don't leave us." Andrew felt his throat tighten. "We won't." "You better mean that. Because if we fail, if we close after a year or 2, we'll do more damage than if we'd never opened." "I know, that's why we won't fail." The Rose Henderson Community Health Center opened on a Saturday morning in late September. At 7:30 minutes before opening, Andrew arrived to find a line stretching around the block. Families with kids, elderly people with walkers, young men dragged by their mothers, people who'd been waiting for something like this for years. Andrew stood at the entrance, overwhelmed. Dr. Price pulled up and just stared. "Well," she said finally, "I guess we better open." They unlocked the doors at 8 sharp. Andrew and Dr. Price stood at the entrance, greeting each person. "Welcome to Rose Henderson. Thank you for being here." An older man stopped in front of Andrew, maybe 70, moving slowly, breathing with effort. "Is it true you don't turn anyone away?" "It's true," Andrew said. "No one gets turned away." The man's eyes filled with tears. "I haven't seen a doctor in 14 years. Couldn't afford it." Andrew felt his own eyes burning. "Well, let's get you taken care of. Come on in." The waiting room filled up fast. Kids running around, the sound of coughing, crying babies. the smell of coffee mixing with new paint. It smelled like hope. Andrew's first patient was a 9-year-old boy named Terrell, who'd been coughing for 2 months. His mother, Carmen, looked exhausted. "The school keeps sending him home," Carmen said. "But I don't have insurance. I make just enough that I don't qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to afford the insurance they offer. The emergency room cost $200 just to be seen. I can't afford that." Andrew listened to Terrell's lungs, wheezing, classic asthma. "Has he had trouble breathing, especially at night or when he exercises?" Carmen nodded. "He wakes up coughing, can't run with the other kids. I think Terrell has asthma. It's very treatable. Can you tell me about your living situation? Any mold, pests, smokers in the home?" Carmen's face flushed. "We live in an older building. The landlord doesn't fix things. There's mold in the bathroom. My upstairs neighbor smokes. The carpet is really old." Andrew made notes. "Those environmental triggers are making Terrell's asthma worse. We're going to work on 2 fronts. Getting his asthma controlled with medication, and connecting you with resources to help with the housing issues." He taught Carmen how to use an inhaler, prescribed albuterol and a controller medication. Then he called in Lisa Martinez. "Lisa can help you file a complaint about your landlord, connect you with legal aid, and possibly find resources for relocating." Carmen stared at him. "You're going to help me with my landlord? Your son's asthma won't get better if we just treat the symptoms and ignore the cause. How much is this going to cost?" Andrew pulled up the fee schedule. "The visit is free. The medications will be $10 total. Lisa's services are free." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "That's it. That's all." She burst into tears. Andrew waited while she cried, handed her tissues. He aborted while she cried, handed her tissues. When she'd composed herself, she looked at him with such raw gratitude, it made his chest ache. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been so scared watching him struggle to breathe. Thank you." After they left, Andrew sat in his exam room alone. This was why he'd become a doctor. This moment right here, making a real difference. He'd forgotten what this felt like. Dr. Price knocked. "You okay?" "Yeah, just processing." "It's intense, isn't it?" Andrew nodded. "I saw a 9-year-old with asthma that's been untreated for 2 months because his family couldn't afford care. That's what we're here for." Dr. Price checked her watch. "We've got 32 people still waiting. Ready for your next patient?" Andrew stood up, straightened his white coat. "Ready." He saw 23 patients that first day. Uncontrolled diabetes, untreated hypertension, infected wounds, depression and anxiety, arthritis, kids who'd never had their vision checked, patient after patient with problems that were completely fixable if someone just took the time to look. By 6 p.m., Andrew was exhausted, but it was a different exhaustion. More personal, more intense. Every patient wasn't just a case, they were a neighbor. Dr. Price knocked on his door. "How you holding up?" "Tired." "Get used to it. This is every day from now on." She sat down. "You did good work today. What if we can't sustain it?" he asked quietly. "Then we'll deal with it," Dr. Price interrupted. "But right now, we've got funding and a team and people who need us. So let's focus on that. One day at a time. One day at a time." Those words became Andrew's mantra over the following months. They saw an average of 70 patients a day. They connected people with food assistance, housing resources, job training. They started diabetes education classes, smoking cessation groups, prenatal care programs. They saved lives, like Gerald Thompson, 61, who came in for a free blood pressure screening and ended up getting emergency bypass surgery for coronary artery disease that would have killed him within weeks. Like Jasmine Williams, 16, who came in thinking she had the flu and was diagnosed with appendicitis hours before it ruptured. Like Tamika Lewis, 38, whose persistent headaches turned out to be caused by a brain tumor, caught early enough to treat successfully. One day at a time, they proved that quality healthcare didn't have to be a luxury, but it wasn't easy. The clinic struggled with funding despite Richard's deep pockets. Medicaid reimbursement rates were so low that every patient with Medicaid cost them money. The regulations were Byzantine, and there was pushback from other healthcare providers who saw them as unfair competition. The criticism hurt. Op-eds arguing that free clinics created dependency,
politicians suggesting people should make better choices. Even some doctors at Chicago General who questioned whether Andrew was wasting his talent. But then he'd think about Dorothy Washington, who'd gotten her blood sugar under control for the first time in 10 years. About Terrell, who could finally breathe. About Carmen, who'd told him he'd given her son his childhood back. And he'd remember why he was doing this. 6 months after opening, the Rose Henderson Community Health Center received its first major donation from someone other than Richard, $50,000 from an anonymous donor. The handwritten note simply read, "In memory of someone who should have had access to care like this." 2 months later came a city grant to expand mental health services, then another for a mobile health unit. Corporate sponsors began reaching out, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The model was working, people were noticing, and slowly, what had once seemed impossible was becoming real. But success brought attention, both wanted and unwanted. On the positive side, a foundation in Milwaukee asked about replicating the model. Medical students requested rotations. The mayor visited the clinic and publicly praised its outcomes. On the other side, the backlash began. The Chicago Medical Association launched a formal inquiry. Several private practice physicians filed complaints, and James Whitmore, through his lawyers, sent a cease and desist letter accusing Andrew of defamation. Andrew sat across from Thomas Sterling in a downtown coffee shop, reviewing the latest legal threats. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside. "They're trying to intimidate you," Thomas said calmly. "The CMA inquiry is procedural harassment. Your outcomes are better than most private practices, and Whitmore's defamation threat is legally baseless." "Then why does it feel like I'm drowning?" Andrew asked. "Because you're fighting on multiple fronts," Thomas replied. "And because you're winning. What you've built threatens the existing system. If quality healthcare doesn't require massive profits, the whole structure starts to crack." "I'm not trying to destroy anything." "I know," Thomas said gently, "but helping people often means challenging systems that profit from their suffering." The CMA investigation dragged on for 5 months. Investigators reviewed patient files, interviewed staff, observed clinical operations. It was invasive and exhausting, but it revealed something unexpected. Rose Henderson's outcomes were significantly better than the city average. Lower hospital readmissions, better chronic disease control, higher preventive care rates, despite serving one of the poorest populations in Chicago. "How is this possible?" asked one investigator, Dr. Kenneth Morrison, during a site visit. "Relationships," Andrew said. "We know our patients, we see them regularly. We address transportation, food insecurity, housing, medication costs. We treat the whole person. But that takes time. We're not maximizing profit," Andrew said. "We're maximizing health." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "The CMA will dismiss the inquiry. Your outcomes speak for themselves. But Andrew, what you're doing threatens powerful people. Be careful." 3 weeks later, the warning proved true. The Illinois legislature introduced a bill imposing new regulations on community health centers. On the surface, it seemed reasonable. In practice, it was designed to be expensive and suffocating. Richard didn't hesitate. "Whitmore's behind this. His hospitals are losing emergency room revenue because people are coming here. He's using the legislature to shut you down." "So what do we do?" Andrew asked. "We fight," Richard said, publicly. They organized a rally. Dorothy Washington helped coordinate with churches, advocacy groups, and community organizations. On a Saturday morning in late May, more than 400 people gathered outside the clinic. Patients, families, healthcare workers, journalists. They held signs reading "Healthcare is a human right and stop protecting profits over patients." Dorothy spoke first, her voice fierce as she described how the clinic had saved her life. Carmen talked about Terrell's asthma finally being controlled. Patient after patient told their stories. The media coverage was extensive. Editorials followed. Social media exploded with support. Legislators began backing away from the bill. Hearings were delayed. Eventually it died in committee. Late one night, Andrew stood alone in the clinic, looking at photos on the walls, health fairs, newborns, community events. What had started as a fragile dream was now real and dangerous. His phone buzzed. "The mayor wants to meet," Richard texted. "Wants to talk about expanding citywide." The meeting with Mayor Victoria Rodriguez took place at City Hall. "The Rose Henderson model is working," she said. "We want to replicate it across Chicago, targeting wards with the highest uninsured rates. City funding, private partnerships. You'd oversee clinical standards." It was everything Andrew had hoped for. "What's the catch?" he asked. "Politics," the mayor said plainly. "Whitmore is opposing this aggressively. He's threatening to primary supporters. So what do you need from me? I need you to be the face of this, to tell your story, all of it." The thought made Andrew's chest tighten, but he thought about Dorothy, about Terrell, about people still waiting for care. "Okay," he said. The campaign was brutal. Andrew told his story again and again to reporters, at town halls on television. Each retelling reopened old wounds. Whitmore's allies followed them everywhere, accusing Andrew of incompetence, dependency, socialism. At one West Side town hall, a planted heckler shouted, "Why should we trust you? You lost your license because you're incompetent." The room erupted. Then Dorothy stood. "I've been diabetic for 20 years, she said. "Most doctors spent 10 minutes with me, and sent me away with prescriptions I couldn't afford. Dr. Henderson sees me as a person. He saved my life." Thunderous applause drowned out the heckler. Momentum built. An editorial titled "The Doctor Who Wouldn't Stay Down" went viral. Physicians spoke out, patients testified at city council meetings. The vote came down to one alderman, David Baker. "My father was a construction worker," Baker said quietly. "He rationed medication because he couldn't afford care. He died at 61. The chamber was silent. "I'm voting yes," he said, "because no one else's father should die for that reason." The vote passed, 31 to 19. The gallery erupted. Andrew stood frozen amid tears and cheers, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They'd done it. 3 years after opening the first center, the network had grown to 12 clinics across 5 states. They served over 40,000 patients a year, prevented thousands of ER visits, and trained dozens of physicians in community-based care. Andrew, the former janitor, the disgraced doctor, had become the steward of a movement. Still, he never forgot why it mattered. Whenever the work overwhelmed him, he'd sit in on a patient visit. One afternoon, he met Grace Martinez, 24, newly diagnosed with lupus, terrified. Andrew spent an hour explaining the disease, holding her hand while she cried, connecting her with specialists. As she left, she turned back. "Thank you for seeing me. You matter," Andrew said. "That's the point." Afterward, he sat alone and thought of his grandmother Rose, of the promise he'd made to use his gift. He had kept it. In the network's 4th year, as Andrew prepared to speak at a national conference, the news broke. James Whitmore indicted on federal corruption charges. Dr. Price burst into his office, phone shaking in her hand. The charges were sweeping: bribery, fraud, illegal campaign contributions. Decades of corruption laid bare. Andrew felt no joy, only completion. "It doesn't give me back those years," he said quietly. "But it confirms something, that speaking up mattered," Dr. Price said. That night, Andrew drove to the cemetery, and sat beside his grandmother's grave. He told her everything: the clinics, the patients, the indictment. "We helped more than one person," he whispered. As he left, a woman approached him. "You don't know me," she said, "but you treated my daughter years ago. She had asthma. She's in medical school now. She wants to help people the way you helped us." Andrew couldn't speak. Later, driving home past neighborhoods, now home to Rose Henderson centers, Andrew thought about cycles, how sacrifice became legacy, how courage multiplied. "If you can help just one person," Rose had said, but it was never just one. He smiled. He had kept his promise, and that was enough.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.